All right.
Okay, hello everyone. We'll be presenting on book 15, lines 420 through 539. So, to start with a little bit of background on just what our excerpt is about, it follows Emmaus, who is a trusted swineherd of Ithaca, and he's describing to a disguised Odysseus the story of his own migration to Ithaca and how he ended up there. So Odysseus has only just returned to Ithaca in the context of this episode, and he's currently passing himself off as a son of Castor. And so when he asks Emmaus to explain his story, Emmaus tells him how he was born as a wealthy prince in Sidon, which is present day Lebanon. And in his earliest youth, when a group of Phoenician sailors came to Sidon for trade, one of the slave girls for King Ctesias, who is Emmaus's father, asked to be hidden away on their ship when they leave. And she further offers to bring gold and the young Emmaus with her on the boat, promising that the boy will fetch a high price. And on the voyage, the girl is killed by an arrow from Artemis, but Zeus then supplies the Phoenicians with favorable winds the rest of the way until they reach Ithaca. And thereafter, Emmaus is sold to Laertes, who is, of course, Odysseus's father. And Laertes subsequently raises the boy almost as a son alongside Anticlea. Uh, he's also raised alongside Citymene and Odysseus, and he's treated very well, largely as an equal to Citymene, though he learns to be very grateful and loyal for their hospitality, whereas the girl does not. Um, and as a result, he grows up to be a remarkably virtuous man who represents adherence to the vastly important Greek custom of xenia, or friendship and reverence for strangers. Emmaus is fiercely loyal and loves Odysseus deeply and thus expresses hatred for Penelope's suitors. And as Emmaus finishes his tale, Telemachus actually arrives in Ithaca, and with his ship comes a good omen in the form of a hawk carrying a dove. And he has since fostered a very positive relationship with Telemachus, a connection which the audience is starkly aware of as Emmaus Telemachus and the still disguised Odysseus share supper in the next scene. So our thesis for this story is that it's essentially a parallel of Odysseus's own um, early days, and thus their interaction in this chapter serves as one of the most intimate demonstrations of Xenia that we can find in this text.
Okay. All right. So before we look at the actual interaction between Aeneas and Odysseus, we first can sort of trace this lineage of Xenia back to the Iliad. And while it's not the most prevalent or the most important type of sort of relationship in ancient Greek custom in the Iliad, that I would say being Kleos, it is present, and we can see it sort of form this basis which continues into the Odyssey. And we can find that in the Odyssey it's sort of reversed, where Xenia finds itself in a more important role than Kleos. And so in the Iliad, just a few examples of Xenia are between Menelaus and the Trojan princes. Obviously, Paris breaks Xenia between Menelaus by stealing away um, the Spartan princess Helen of Troy. So that sort of kicks off the entire story and sequence of events, which is particularly notable because it sort of begins and ends with Xenia. Then we have Diomedes and Glaucus, two warriors who meet on the battlefield, and they, after talking to each other, they realize that their fathers exchanged Xenia, and therefore they decide not to fight. And then at the end of the Iliad, we have Achilles and Priam. Priam being the enemy king, um, he wouldn't expect Achilles to show hospitality to him, but by the laws of Xenia, he feels obligated to, and so we have this image on the right that sort of shows King Priam appealing to Achilles for his son Hector's body back. So now we go to Xenia and the Odyssey. And pretty much the whole narrative focuses on sort of these relationships and these practices of Xenia between the various characters. We have Telemachus and Penelope practicing Xenia between the suitors. We have Menelaus and Helen and Nestor practicing Xenia between Telemachus. We have Eumaeus practicing Xenia with Odysseus. Same with the Phaeacians. Same with Polyphemus, although he doesn't uphold the rules of Xenia, which is notable, as well as Circe and Calypso, who um, also don't really uphold the rules of Xenia, but they serve as more negative examples of it. But we are focusing on the interaction between Eumaeus and Odysseus. It's sort of this last example of Xenia we can really focus in on in the Odyssey, because after this interaction we have Odysseus reclaiming Ithaca and sort of the slaying of the suitors and all those story elements which don't really revolve around Xenia to as much of an extent. And so Xenia, this concept of guest friendship, exchanging of gifts, honors, and stories, it's very prevalent within the text, as you can see with these two lines. Eumaeus, may you be as dear to Father Zeus as you are to me, for you have given me a rest from wandering the world in grief and pain. Nothing is harder on a man than homelessness. So this sort of idea that we have this wandering vagabond and kind of all around sketchy looking guy in Odysseus. Um, Even though they grew up together, Eumaeus doesn't really recognize him because he's so sort of worn down and he's aged 20 years, obviously. And so, despite his looks, he welcomes Odysseus into his household, which is a clear demonstration of the virtue of Eumaeus. And then in this other line, we have well, stranger, since you're curious about this, sit back, relax, and drink your wine. These nights are ungodly long. There's time to sleep and to enjoy stories both. And so this sort of um, goes into this idea of exchanging. And so when Eumaeus invites um, Odysseus into his household, he's sort of giving him not only sort of food and hospitality, but also he's giving him this spiritual relief in the form of the story he tells him about his upbringing. Um, and then tacked on to the idea of Xenia, there's also this idea of theoxany, which is basically that gods will come down and sort of mingle among mortals, and those who show them favor will be rewarded by the gods. Um, and so we have these sort of portrayals of both Odysseus and of Eumaeus, godlike Odysseus. So it's kind of alluding to the fact that Odysseus is sort of this divine figure, even though he's very much mortal. Um, Throughout this passage, it sort of echoes this idea of theoxany. So, godlike Odysseus, and then Eumaeus is talked about as noble swineherd, which is kind of alluding to his treatment of a stranger, his good treatment of a stranger, which most people wouldn't be inclined to do so. And then one more, Zeus bred Odysseus, which is just again sort of hinting at Odysseus's divinity, in a sense. And so Eumaeus's backstory, it sort of parallels Odysseus's, and this is one of the most important sort of aspects of this excerpt, because it sort of it sets the groundwork for why this exchange of Xenia between the two is so intimate, and furthermore it it really kind of caps off the story as it has happened so far. So we've seen Odysseus sort of hop from island to island, sort of exchanging good Xenia and bad Xenia with these various peoples and creatures. And in this final sort of exchange of Xenia, it's really wholesome, and it shows what Xenia should be, and sort of it's the perfect exemplification of what Xenia should be, and that's really important because this text is so focused on Xenia.
So I'm going to talk about the Phoenician men who didn't really follow the moral culture of Xenia that the Greeks upheld. So one quote that I want to look at was, "One day, some Phoenician traders arrived, greedy men with a shipload of baubles." So the men were seen as greedy and craggy and cunning, and adjectives used to paint them as unsavory. Another quote that I wanted to look at was one of the craggy Phoenicians seduced her as she was washing her clothes, lying with her in their hollow ship, the sort of thing that will gall the mind of any woman. The men are depicted as abusing their power and influence for personal gain, yet Amos's father is depicted more favorably, even though he did a similar thing by purchasing the Phoenician girl as a slave. These men are portrayed unfavorably to show how great the Greeks are. These men are not liked by the people of Greece because they don't follow the culture of our practices of Xenia.
All right. So now we're moving on to the Phoenician woman, who sort of carries some interesting parallels between Eumaeus' story and Odysseus' story. And so these two quotes that sort of are of particular note are, "She took me by the hand and led me outside, stopping on the porch to scoop up 3 of the golden goblets left on the tables by retainers of my father who had banqueted there, and then gone off to debate in the council. She tucked these goblets into her bosom and bore them off. I innocently followed." And then this other one, "They threw overboard for the seals and fish, and there I was with a broken heart." And so this particular character, while she's never named, you can draw some sort of interesting parallels between her and the more cunning, I guess, women that Odysseus encounters, such as Calypso and Circe. Um, and so in this, like in this quote, "And there I was with a broken heart," and then in the other quote, "I innocently followed," we can see that because she was beautiful and because she sort of had this seductive effect, she sort of leads Eumaeus astray, in a sense, which is sort of the same thing that we can see Calypso and Circe doing. They both seduce him to have sex with them, and obviously he's betraying his wife Penelope, and it's a wrong thing to do, but they use their sort of feminine power to to sort of undermine the supposed integrity of these men. Um, in actuality, though, it's interesting because the Phoenician woman, she demonstrates a large amount of agency and resourcefulness. She uses the fact that she's the daughter of a wealthy man back in Phoenicia. I forget where, but she uses that fact to sort of to probe at the Phoenician traders who come and sort of get them to take more interest in her. She also seduces the sailor. She uses her feminine woes to sort of uh, curtail them, and then she makes them swear an oath not to harm her. And then she has the clever idea to bring Eumaeus as leverage, thinking that sort of he will be a valuable asset for the Phoenician men when they try to take her home, because they can obviously sell him for a lot of money because he's of noble birth. Um, and then additionally, just we can find little like hints in the text of sort of her cleverness, stopping on the porch to scoop up 3 of the golden goblets. So she's kind of resourceful. She tucks them into her bosom so she can like hide them away, and she's she's demonstrated with quite a bit of agency in that way, which is um, I guess not unique, but it's interesting to see such a character, such a minor character, demonstrated as so cunning and sort of um, witty, I guess. And this begs the question, sort of why was she struck down by Artemis? As we know, she was a slave girl. She was bought by Eumaeus's father. She didn't necessarily ask for the life she was given. She got robbed from her home and brought there. And all she's really doing is making her escape. And although her sort of decision to bring Eumaeus might be seen as morally wrong, I guess, it's no less of a decision to do that than for Eumaeus's father to buy her as a slave. So it sort of begs the question: does she deserve the death that she got? Does she even deserve to die? Um, and it's interesting to sort of probe at that, given how clever she is and how sort of you can almost be sympathetic to her and her cause. So next we'll talk about Odysseus's humility. This is something that we don't see a lot of up until this part in the text, and it's really because obviously the parallels between Eumaeus and Odysseus, and also the fact that um, Eumaeus is obviously a very good host. And so in these 2 quotes, we have, "You must have been awfully young, Eumaeus, when you were forced to travel so far away from your parents and home. How did it happen?" And so in this quote, he's sort of expressing curiosity, which he doesn't do that often, because throughout most of the text, he's seen sort of boasting and prideful and demonstrating excessive hubris throughout his adventures. And he doesn't really care about the other people he encounters, because it's all about him and it's all about him making his mark. Um, and so upon encountering Eumaeus, he sort of takes this backseat and sort of sits down and processes all that happened, not only to him, but to Eumaeus. And so in this next quote, we have, "Eumaeus, your story with its tale of your painful ordeal has touched my heart. But in your case, Zeus has said some good alongside the evil, since after all your suffering, you wound up at the house of a kindly man who gives you food and drink and treats you well. You have a good life, but as for me, I came here while wandering around from city to city. So we know that Odysseus is Odysseus, but obviously Eumaeus doesn't know that, and so it's kind of interesting, this quote, because Odysseus is sort of acknowledging this fact that, oh, my father was sort of this kindly man that provided to you grace and food and drink, um, and then you're reciprocating that to me in my time of need. And so it's kind of this moment of clarity in Odysseus's story, for him to think that, he's been so prideful all along, and now this man Eumaeus, who he grew up with, is reciprocating sort of this act of xenia, and it really sort of puts things into perspective for Odysseus. But it also sort of begs the question, why is Odysseus being so cryptic and deceitful towards Eumaeus, especially given the fact that they grew up together and they know each other? And then also why that sort of leads the further question of why this interaction takes the form of a theoxany, even though it could be easily just kind of portrayed as, oh, hey, Odysseus, oh, hey, Eumaeus, we know each other, blah, blah, blah. This is what's going on at your home. And it's really interesting how sort of Odysseus takes this extra step to test Eumaeus. And it really shows how sort of how deeply ingrained this idea of theoxany is, even though it's not strictly theoxany, because Odysseus isn't specifically a god, but as we went over earlier, he's shown to be godlike, and so it's quite complex.
Yeah, so just to say a little bit more, to kind of compare Emmaus to characters other than Odysseus, I specifically think there are two other characters we see here whose history can be kind of meaningfully juxtaposed alongside that of Emmaus. Them being the slave girl from Sidon that Tommy touched on, and Sitamine. I think these characters share similar backstories to Emmaus in different ways, but they more function as contrast to him. Uh, it kind of shows how they failed to grow into the virtuous figure who displays so much xenia, which Emmaus is able to achieve. So the slave girl who is with the Phoenicians almost has an identical childhood to Emmaus, in that she was born into a very wealthy situation and then pretty much stolen and sold off into slavery. However, whereas Emmaus is able to arise out of his almost self pity that we see from this girl, he learns to love his captors for what they give him, as opposed to seeing them for what they took away from him. And like while this slave girl longed for escape and even stole from her masters in the process, Emmaus is very obedient and reverent and just kind of learns to appreciate his role within the household. And on the other hand, Sitamine is raised in the same conditions as Emmaus alongside him with the same mother, but she ends up gaining none of the same grateful and really just like friendly qualities that define Emmaus's Xenia. And I think this goes to show how it all just depends on the perspective one takes on their own life in order to achieve this type of growth. And actually, the story even reminds me somewhat of the tale of Joseph from the Old Testament, who is essentially sold into Egyptian slavery by his own brothers out of Canaan. And despite his deeply disadvantageous beginnings, he also manages to rise out of destitution and gain favor through like wisdom and gratitude from his captors. And he actually evolves into a distinguished and beloved figure um, by the very people who have literally purchased him. Um, so much like Emmaus, he doesn't allow spite and hate to just permeate through his heart. And the spirit of like moral friendship and hospitality, even to those one does not know, is enough for him to overcome this adversity. And I think all of these aspects contribute to why Emmaus is able to fill that hole of companionship that Telemachus may have been longing for during Odysseus's extended absence. And it kind of informs why he's even able to extend such hospitality to Odysseus, even when he's somewhat suspicious and standoffish during his disguised phase.
All right, so another parallel that can sort of be made is pretty obvious. It's Bacchus and Philemon. This is sort of the template story of Theoxeny. Um, and it's similar, but it's also very different, which is quite interesting because at least the version we read, it comes from Ovid, and that's nearly 800 years later. So a few things of note. It's interesting that Eumaeus is a swineherd. Um, uh, you wouldn't really think of a swineherd as someone of great repute, um, but obviously Eumaeus is very honorable and virtuous, and kind of compared to Bacchus and Philemon, they're the poorest residents of the village in which they live, but they're the only ones who are sort of able to practice proper xenia. And Eumaeus isn't very well off himself, but given that he's a swineherd, obviously, but sort of there's this parallel there where they're each kind of the lowest of the low, yet they offer all that they have to complete strangers. And so it's also interesting how I wouldn't say more complex the theoxany between Odysseus and Eumaeus is, but it's I guess tied into the larger narrative. It's a lot more interesting, and it's less basic, I would say, because in Bacchus and Philemon, it's sort of just this base reciprocity. Um, Bacchus and Philemon help a disguised Zeus and Hermes, and then Zeus and Hermes obviously reward them. But in the Odyssey, there's sort of this complex web of, oh, Laertes, he treats Eumaeus like a son, and him and Odysseus grow up together. And then Eumaeus later helps Odysseus by giving him hospitality and then helping him slay all the suitors. And then Odysseus ending up sort of honoring Eumaeus and all his help. And so it's kind of this cycle of back and forth, back and forth. And it really just goes to show that even though the Odyssey is at least in the iteration of Bacchus and Philemon that we studied, it's even though it's 800 years older than that, it's still extremely complex, and it sort of possesses this network of reciprocity and theoxany and xenia that isn't really demonstrated as with as much nuance in Bacchus and Philemon. And then a few other parallels we can see. The Epic of Gilgamesh, it's not as direct, but sort of this well-traveled hero in Gilgamesh um, kind of ending up seeking the advice of a very wise and virtuous Utnapishtim, who's obviously the survivor of the flood. That's sort of a trope that we can kind of see extending from the Epic of Gilgamesh into the Odyssey. And then another example from the Bible would be um, in the Gospels with Jesus, and Jesus is the Word became flesh, and he's this guy who kind of hangs around the lowest of the low, and we can sort of see that comparison between Eumenes being sort of Eumaeus being sort of this lowly figure, um, and the people who Jesus hangs out with being these lowly figures. And so now we go to the questions. Why is Xenia such a dominant motif in the Odyssey? What does it say about the cultural values of the ancient Greeks? What is significant about the exchange of Xenia between Eumaeus and Odysseus, especially considering the parallels between the two? And then why does it happen when it does? And for me, just a quick, like, further explanation of each of these questions, and I guess half answer. Why is Xenia such a dominant motif? Basically, why is Odysseus going from island to island, sort of experimenting with Xenia, with these various figures? What does it say about the Odyssey, and more so, what does it say about the customs of the ancient Greeks and what they valued? Um, and then furthermore, the significance about the exchange between Eumaeus and Odysseus. Why is it presented in that way? Why does it sort of take this form of kind of a theoxany? Um, why is it so? Why is it so? Why does Odysseus possess so much humility, and why is Eumaeus so virtuous? And sort of how does the sincerity of this interaction cap off Odysseus's journey home? And then obviously, why does it happen when it does? Why does it happen at the end of, not the complete end, but the end of Odysseus's journey home, when he arrives to Ithaca? Why is this idealized interaction of Xenia? Why does it happen at that specific point in the story? So yeah, that is our presentation, and